I'd like to begin our worship period this morning by offering some brief communion thoughts for the Lord's Supper. If you've already taken the Lord's Supper or plan to take it at a later time, you can go ahead and skip to the sermon. There'll be a timestamp on screen now to let you know when you can go ahead and skip to start our lesson. Isaiah 55:11 reads, "So is my word that goes out from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it." Here, the prophet Isaiah is talking about the Lord's ways, how his ways are so much higher than our ways. They are so much better than our ways, more righteous and more noble. He says how heaven is the highest place, so much higher than any place on earth, any place we can reach, even higher than the mountaintops, it says, a truly wonderful place to be. Isaiah then states in his preceding verse 10, that the rain and the snow fall down from heaven, from that grand place, and they do not return to that place until they have first watered the earth and made it flourish and grow. Their work must first be complete before they can return back to the heavens and begin the cycle anew. And as wonderful and necessary and important as the rain and the snow are in keeping our earth alive for growth, one came from the heavens who is infinitely more important and more necessary and more grand. And that was, of course, Jesus Christ. And where the rain and the snow come back down every so often to keep the earth hydrated, to keep growth sustained on our planet and replenished, Christ will come back only once, at a time we and he himself do not currently know. He will come back just once to reap the work that he has grown here. The work of rain and snow is never done. They must come back often to complete and continue their work, but Christ did not. His work is done. He left the splendor of heaven to bring himself down here on a mission with a purpose to bring salvation to mankind. He did not leave. He did not return to heaven empty-handed. He had accomplished what he came to do, what was desired of him. He achieved that, and the purpose for which he was sent out was fulfilled. Now, to many around the world, Jesus Christ is just some guy, just a random individual like you or like me, who just sprang up out of nowhere one day, some great radical teacher who was unfortunately killed and now lies buried in a tomb somewhere. Nothing more, nothing less. But you and I know better than that. We know that Christ was and is the Son of God, the living Son of God, who willingly came to this earth knowing full well what he had to do and what he had to go through, the mission he had to accomplish, the purpose he came to fulfill. And that accomplishment, that purpose was fulfilled. So as we this morning eat the bread and drink the cup that memorializes what he came to do, let us in fact reflect on what he came to do, his mission, his purpose, why he came here. He came to save souls, to save mine and yours and everyone's here on this planet. And so let's reflect on that this morning as hopefully we are doing our part, as Christ's part has been done to continue his work and save souls, so that when he returns, he will be able to reap a glorious and bountiful harvest. I'll be the first to admit that I do not like storms at all. And this strikes some people, a lot of people, in fact, as kind of odd. You know, whenever it comes up in conversation, I usually hear a lot of, "Oh, I love storms. They're so peaceful and soothing and relaxing, and they make just the perfect backdrop for a wonderful afternoon nap." Apparently, people love to sleep through storms. And that's fine, fair enough, I suppose. In fact, I talked last week about how I can't sleep unless I have a sound machine going, and some people find that pretty strange. So, to each their own. If you can sleep through storms, more power to you. But there is no way I could ever sleep peacefully through a storm. See, when I was growing up, I lived in a very flat part of the country. There was one lone highway that ran in front of our house, but besides that, everything else, our backyard, side yards, across the road there, everything was agricultural fields. There were beans grown there. There was rice grown there. Cotton was grown there. Corn. You name it, they grew it. Flat land as far as the eye could see. And our house, our tiny little wooden matchbox house that just barely disqualified itself from being a mobile trailer home, sat right in the middle of a tornado hotspot. See, growing up, to me, storms weren't nice, peaceful, or relaxing in the slightest. They weren't soothing downpours with sprinklings of gentle rumblings of thunder to lull me to sleep. Storms were terrifying. Because you could see so far out in the distance, you could see the storms approaching from miles and miles away. The sky was always an inky midnight black, and the air around our house was always eerily dead still. And as the storms approached, as they got closer and closer, the wind began to pick up and it would blow, and it would bring in huge dust storms that blocked out all vision. Everything became brown and dirty and disgusting. And as the wind blew, the trees bent and the house groaned under the pressure of the wind, and the sky turned a sickly green color. And my family spent more than our fair share of summer afternoons huddled in our hallway that leads to our bathroom with blankets and pillows over our heads as what sounded like the world's largest vacuum cleaner roared right outside our house. See, to me, storms have never been peaceful or soothing. They are dreadful, terrifying, anxiety-inducing forces of nature. In my opinion, storms are just tornadoes waiting to happen. And I believe I feel that way for a pretty good reason. As a matter of fact, just this past week in the city of Jonesboro, Arkansas, up there in northeast Arkansas, about an hour from where my old matchbox house was located, endured an EF3 tornado that blew right through the city. The damage was incredible, and the video footage captured of that thing just roaring through the city, over the mall, and through houses and whatnot was awe-inspiring, jaw-dropping, and honestly very terrifying. You could see it picking up roofs off of businesses and homes and flinging cars and telephone poles in all sorts of directions, and the aftermath was, of course, just terrible, terrible to witness. And it hurt to see a place that I knew so well and grew up so close to in such a state. But while the tornado was there, it only injured about 22 people, and miraculously, there were 0 fatalities recorded during that storm. In fact, officials say that if it weren't for the fact that businesses in the mall were closed due to the COVID-19 pandemic, if it had been any other ordinary Saturday busy with shops full of people, that situation could have been much, much worse. The storm that struck Jonesboro could be considered what we would call a storm of life. That may be a phrase you've heard tossed around a few times before in your life, but for those who are unfamiliar, a storm of life is, put simply, a hardship that we experience in our lives. Sometimes the weather is nice and clear and sunny, and sometimes the weather is dark and nasty and maybe even dangerous, quite like a storm. Well, it's the same with life. Sometimes life is good and pleasant and easy, and sometimes life is hard and painful and dark and perhaps dangerous. Again, quite like a storm. A storm of life could be a trial or tribulation that we must face in our lives, something incredibly difficult. But not just something that's difficult, because it almost makes it sound too easy. A storm of life might be something that we would consider impossibly hard to get through. It's not just a minor obstacle that we get through and get over and move on with, but it is something very, very challenging. Something that will rob us of our hope, will bring us to our lowest points in our lives. Something that we must overcome that will either make us or break us. Now, sometimes the storms in our lives are, well, literal storms. We have plenty of biblical examples of people dealing with literal, actual storms in their lives. Perhaps the most world famous of these, someone dealing with a storm in their life recorded in the Bible, would be that of Noah. Now, Noah didn't face down just any old storm. He didn't have to just take shelter for a couple of hours from some rain and some wind and some lightning. Noah faced the storm, a world-ending storm brought down by the very righteous judgment of God himself. Now, perhaps the most obvious instance of somebody dealing with a literal storm recorded in the Bible, maybe the one you thought of as soon as we started our lesson this morning, would be that of Jesus Christ himself, who got into a boat with his disciples, went out across the lake when suddenly a huge storm arrived and threatened to tear apart their entire boat. And the disciples found Jesus there sleeping and said, "Lord, what must we do?" And he said, "Why do you have such little faith?" And then he proceeded to calm the storms. The winds were driven away and the waves calmed themselves. And then his disciples marveled at how he was able to calm nature in such a fashion. But many times, however, the storms of life that we face in our lives are not literal, actual storms, but more figurative in nature. Instead of being wind and lightning and thunder, it is more along the lines of personal loss, maybe doubts and fears. Perhaps it is more like losing things that we love, losing people we love, making hard, stressful decisions in our lives. From all the way back in the beginning, we have instances of this. One of the earliest recorded scripture stories in the Bible would be that of Job. And Job dealt with a great many storms in his life. In fact, Job's story there is perhaps the most well-known and most often turned to story when we're dealing with our own storms in our own lives. In fact, Job's story is so well known that, of course, people turn to it and no matter what is going on in their lives, because it does offer something for us to learn from. Job lost his family, his possessions, and even his health. Job's life was in such a state that his friends showed up, his quote-unquote friends arrived to ask Job, "What in the world have you done to deserve this wrath of God?" And even his wife told Job to, in essence, give up, to curse God and die and let that be it. Now, the figurative storms that Job faced were vicious and ferocious, but Job, it says here, in fact, faced physical storms as well. There in Job chapter 1, as all of Job's messengers are coming to him and telling him, "Job, this that you own has been destroyed. You've lost this, you've lost these." One of them says that a great wind, a storm came and destroyed the house that Job's children were in, claiming their lives. And then later in chapter 38, it says that out of the storm, God finally spoke to Job. How heavily the storms of life affected and impacted Job. Now, we have these great examples written here in the Bible for our teaching and encouragement, as Paul reminds us in Romans 15. Because, unfortunately, we will face these trials in our lives. It's not a question of if we will face them, but when we will face them. Just like the weather, when it comes to life, there are good days and there are bad days. There are seasons of life that will test us. They will change how we live and affect what we do. James makes mention of this very often in the first chapter of his letter when he says, when you will face trials. As great as it would be to avoid the trials in this life, we know that is not a luxury that we have. Satan has much sway in this world. After all, he is known as the god of this age and the prince of this world, and he will do whatever it takes, whatever he can, to bring us to our lowest points and separate us from God. Anyone who has lived life long enough knows that these hardships are a guarantee. And that changes the question from how do I avoid the storms in my life to what do I do when the storms of life arise? How do I manage? What must I do to survive? Well, by looking at one particular individual in the Bible, we can discern three possible actions we can take when these storms of life arise. We can either run from the storms, we can ignore the storms, or we can grow from the storms. And that individual that we can look to, for example, on these actions is none other than Jonah. But Jonah is not a great example for his swift victories and his successes in taking these actions. Jonah makes a great example because out of these three actions, he tried and failed every single one of them. Let's look at Jonah's story. In the very beginning, chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah to go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness had come before the Lord." Jonah did not want to go to Nineveh. Not only was it a grueling trek of almost 600 miles from where Jonah lived, but they were vile pagans, wicked people who did evil in the sight of God. Jonah wanted nothing to do with Nineveh. So Jonah's storm has appeared in front of him, and now he has a choice. And what does Jonah try first? Well, he tries to run from his storms. Let's look at verse 3. "But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. And after paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord." Jonah hoped that he could run away from the trials that had been placed before him. And you know, as much flack as we give Jonah in his story for the decisions he made in his behavior, in this instance, I can't help but I can't say I blame him. You know, we do give Jonah a lot of flack for that, but given the opportunity, given the chance, if we had a chance to run from the storms and trials in our lives, I think if we're honest, we might be willing to at least attempt it to avoid those hardships. I know, me personally, I would much rather run from and avoid those hardships and have to actually go through them. But as we know from this story, that is not a possibility. And in Jonah's case, running is not an option. Let's look at verse 4. "Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship." Jonah could not run from the now literal storm that was in his life. He tried, but it found him, and it kept at him, as these storms always do. So running's out of the question. What does Job try next? Well, he tries to ignore the storm in his life. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. When running from God, the storm in his life had failed, Jonah tried to ignore it, to purge it from his mind. He went down into the ship and attempted to escape God's command. Of course, that didn't work either, because as we know, it is pretty difficult, if not impossible, to ignore when these storms of life show up at our doorstep. When they're right there in our face, consuming everything around us, we can't just ignore them. That's not possible. Especially when they are affecting us and affecting those around us. No matter how hard we try, we cannot simply ignore the hardships in our lives. So the captain of the ship comes down to wake Jonah and figure out what in the world is going on, what has brought this storm to their ship. And they, of course, discover by casting light that it is Jonah's fault. And Jonah says to throw himself overboard, and that will calm the storm. So the men of the ship do, and that does calm the literal storm in Jonah's life, but we know that Jonah's figurative storm of life is far from over. For God has prepared a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah remained in the belly of that fish for 3 days before he was spat out on a dry land, and then finally hauled himself off to Nineveh. Finally, at Nineveh's gates, no longer able to run or to hide, with no other options left before him, Jonah faces his storm, and he preaches God to the city of Nineveh. And ultimately acknowledging the storm in his life and facing it should have been a great moment to grow for Jonah. What a fantastic character arc it would have been for Jonah if he had learned from his mistakes and learned from his failures and put that experience towards being a better, more mature person. Because that is how we grow. We don't grow in complacency. We can't grow in stagnation. We require testing in order to grow. James chapter 1, verses 3 through 4. Because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. The storms, the hardships, the trials, the tests, whatever you want to call them, they happen for a reason. Now, we may not know that overall reason in the grand scheme of God's plan while we are here on this earth, but we do know that we have not been tested with more than we are able to handle. That's 1 Corinthians 3:10. And again, thanks to James, we know that the testing of our faith produces perseverance, maturity, and completion. These hardships, as terrible as they may be in the present, dealing with them, do provide us with great opportunities to better ourselves and better the kingdom of God. But did Jonah grow from his storm? Unfortunately, it looks like he did not. When it came to the actions that Jonah took to survive and conquer the storms in his life, Jonah went 0 for 3. He struck out. After Nineveh repented, Jonah was angry. He was mad that the city had been saved. He said, in fact, God, this is what I was trying to avoid when I ran from you and ignored you earlier. I knew that you are a loving and compassionate and merciful God and would show mercy to these people that I do not like, these wicked, vile people who deserve your judgment. So now I've come and done it. They are saved, and you, God, made me do it. And then Jonah goes out and pouts because he saved a city from destruction. And then, almost like a patient parent knocking on their child's door and peeking in as they are sitting there angry, God asks, Jonah, is it right for you to be angry? And of course, Jonah says, it is. In fact, I'm so mad I wish I were dead. Jonah's storms got the better of him. They won. They battered and beat him down to his lowest point. But instead of rising back up and learning from them and using them to better his life and the lives of others around him, Jonah let them win. He let his storms defeat him. And that's where Jonah's story ends. We don't know what Jonah did or what happened to Jonah after this story, but we do know that Jonah failed. And we have his story, and we read it, and we study it, again, because we know that these things are written for our teaching and encouragement. We can learn from Jonah's failures. And we need to know, and we need to study, and we need to learn all about these instances because these storms are coming. If they haven't come already, they will. We are not exempt from hardships in life simply because we are Christians. We know from Paul in Romans chapter 2 that God does not show favoritism. And from Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 that God sends his rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Everyone on planet Earth either has, is, or will experience these hardships in our lives. And I don't know what storm you are facing down today. Maybe they are literal storms, dealing with those and the aftermath of those. Or maybe they are figurative storms, dealing with loss or anxiety, stress, grief, doubts, fears. But whatever you may be facing, I urge you to do what Jonah did not. Don't run from God as Jonah did, but run instead to God. Seek the one who calms the storms, because he can calm you. I don't think it's any coincidence that there is so much buildup and symbolism between the hardships of life and storms, only for Jesus to then arrive and literally calm and put away an actual storm. The significance and symbolism there is so powerful. Whatever you are facing right now, however bad it may be, Jesus is more powerful, and he can and will calm your storm and calm you. As we read about in the Psalms, David poured out his heart during times of trial. But he was always quick to remind us that if we seek God during our times of hardship, we will find him, and he will come to our aid. In the 57th Psalm, David says, "Have mercy on me, my God, have mercy on me, for in you I take refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster has passed." And just to cement our God as a shelter from the storms of life, David again says of the Lord in the 107th Psalm, "He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed." While God is a shelter for us during our storms of life, we have to remember that God is always there with us, not just when life is hard. Now, some people don't like that, and some people don't want that. They only want to remember God and cry out to him when things in their life look bleak. But as soon as things are back to normal, everything is good again, they want God to go away so that they can do instead what they want to do. But there's no growth there. Crying out to God in times of hardship and then ignoring him when times are good does not grow us spiritually, because there's no repentance there. There's no life that's changed there. God being with us continually allows us to continually grow with him. Once God sees us out of those dark times, he is still with us, always in the light, to make us stronger and better than we were before. Or else we'll just regress back to the same place we were before the storm struck, and we'll be stuck in that same boat when those storms inevitably come again. God is always with us in the good and the bad of life, and his invitation is always offered to us. Help and relief and a refuge from the storms of life are always available for us to accept. But again, it is up to us to accept them. And if we do, there is no storm that can be thrown our way that our God cannot conquer and see us through. So this morning, whatever storm you find yourself facing, whether it be figurative or a literal actual storm, seek the one who calms the storms, and he will calm your storm and you.